Borrowed Authority, Kate Webster and the Limits of Domestic Obedience. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivian. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, stored on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Preface. Kate Webster did not enter history simply because she killed. Victorian England was not unfamiliar with violence, nor was it short of women who committed it. Assault, domestic brutality, and even murder formed a grim but recognizable part of 19th-century life, particularly among the poor. What distinguished Webster was not merely the act itself, but what followed it. She entered history because she refused to disappear. Most crimes committed by domestic servants followed a predictable and socially reassuring trajectory. Theft was discovered, suspicion hardened, dismissal followed. The servant left the household, often abruptly, often without reference, and the domestic space returned to order. Even when violence occurred, it was typically followed by flight. The servant vanished into the anonymity of the city, absorbed back into the mass of laboring poor from which she had briefly emerged. The household, and the hierarchy it represented, survived intact. Kate Webster did not conform to this pattern. After killing Julia Martha Thomas, she remained in the house. She stayed where she was not permitted to stay. She occupied space that was not hers, assumed a role that had not been granted, and behaved, however imperfectly, as though authority could be enacted rather than bestowed. This refusal to retreat unsettled Victorian society far more deeply than the killing itself. For several days after the murder, Webster lived inside the life of the woman she had killed. She wore her employer's clothes. She answered her employer's door. She spoke to neighbors as though nothing fundamental had changed. She sold household property openly. She moved through the domestic space not as a servant at work, but as an occupant with apparent entitlement. This was not concealment through absence. It was concealment through substitution. Violence, however brutal, could be contained within familiar moral categories. Occupation could not. The notion that a servant might step into her mistress's life, even temporarily, exposed the fragility of a domestic order that relied less on force than on consent, routine, and performance. Authority within the Victorian household was not constantly enforced through coercion. It was sustained through repetition, expectation, and the assumption that servants would internalize their own subordination. Kate Webster's crime violated this assumption. This book does not attempt to rehabilitate Kate Webster. It does not argue for sympathy where harm was real, sustained, and final. Julia Martha Thomas was killed in her own home, violently and without reprieve. That fact cannot be softened, contextualized away, or morally balanced. Nor does this study seek to sensationalize the crime or to indulge in retrospective psychological speculation. What this book seeks instead is clarity. When reduced to caricature, madwoman, monster, aberration, Webster's actions appear inexplicable except as moral failure. Such explanations offer emotional closure, but little understanding. They isolate the crime from the conditions that made it possible, and in doing so, they protect the system within which it occurred from scrutiny. When Webster's actions are placed within the structures that govern domestic service, female obedience, class surveillance, and punishment in Victorian England, they become not excusable, but intelligible. Domestic service was the largest single category of female employment in 19th-century Britain. It offered wages and shelter, but at a cost rarely acknowledged by those who benefited from it. Servants were required to submit without security, to perform intimacy without dignity, and to obey without recourse. They lived inside other people's homes, under constant observation. Their labor was inseparable from their character. Speech, posture, temperament, and even facial expression were subject to judgment. Correction was expected to be received quietly. Complaint was treated as moral failure. Dismissal carried consequences far beyond the loss of employment. A servant dismissed without a reference could find herself unemployable. Without wages came homelessness. Without shelter came exposure to the workhouse, prison, or dependence on unstable relationships. The system offered no mechanism for repair. There was no pathway back from reputational damage. One failed position narrowed future options permanently. Within this hierarchy, authority flowed in one direction only. Employers commanded, servants complied. Resistance was not merely inconvenient, it was interpreted as a threat to social order itself. Obedience was framed as virtue, defiance as degeneracy. The servant who answered back did not simply disrupt a household. She disrupted a moral economy. Kate Webster was ill-suited to this arrangement. Her early life, shaped by poverty, migration, and instability, offered little preparation for the sustained self-erasure domestic service demanded. Her employment history shows repeated conflict, dismissal, and accusation. She argued openly. She resisted correction. She failed to perform submission convincingly. These traits were recorded not as responses to strain, but as evidence of innate character. Behavior became destiny. By the time Webster entered Julia Martha Thomas's household in Richmond, she carried with her a reputation already shaped by suspicion. Mrs. Thomas, a respectable widow of limited but carefully managed means, represented precisely the form of authority domestic service existed to reinforce: moral, proprietary, and uncompromising. Her household was not unusually cruel. It was orderly, exacting, and intolerant of defiance. These were virtues in Victorian domestic ideology. The violence that followed was sudden. The occupation that followed was deliberate. This book traces Webster's life before, during, and after that moment, not to excuse her actions, but to understand the conditions that made them possible, legible, and intolerable. It examines her work history, her relationships, her motherhood, and the gradual narrowing of legitimate options. It reconstructs Julia Martha Thomas's position carefully, not as a passive emblem of victimhood, but as a woman whose authority was socially sanctioned and fiercely protected. The sources available for such a study are necessarily partial. Much of what is known about Kate Webster comes from court records and newspaper accounts, documents shaped by male clerks, editorial convention, and moral judgment. These records prioritize action over endurance, outcome over process. They tell us what Webster did, how she was seen, and how she was punished. They do not tell us what it cost her to remain employable, housed, or fed. Where the record is silent, this book does not invent. It contextualizes. It reads patterns across employment histories, testimonies, and institutional responses. It treats domestic service not as background, but as a system with consequences. Silence is not interpreted as absence of feeling, but as evidence of whose interior lives were considered worthy of preservation. Kate Webster's crime was not simply murder. It was impersonation. It was occupation. It was the refusal to retreat into invisibility once violence had occurred. That refusal provoked a response more severe than the act alone can explain. The state did not merely punish the killing. It eradicated the breach of hierarchy the killing exposed. To understand why, we must begin long before the blow was struck, before the argument, before the dismissal, before the occupation of the house. We must begin with the conditions that made obedience mandatory, resistance unforgivable, and authority appear natural until the moment it was seized. Chapter 1: Early Life. Kate Webster was born into a world that did not expect to remember her. She entered life in Ireland in the early 1840s, at a moment when survival itself had become precarious for the rural poor. Her childhood unfolded in the shadow of the Great Famine, an event whose effects extended far beyond the years of crop failure. The famine did not merely destroy food supplies, it dismantled social structures, fractured households, and reordered the terms of endurance for an entire generation. For those born into poverty, particularly girls, the famine's aftermath meant that stability became episodic rather than continuous. Families dispersed. Children were moved between households. Work replaced schooling at an early age, and migration ceased to be an option and became an expectation. The rhythms of childhood were subordinated to the demands of survival. The documentary record preserves almost nothing of Webster's family life. There is no reliable account of her parents, siblings, or early home. This absence is not exceptional. Poor children, especially girls, rarely enter the archive unless they pass through institutions of control, workhouses, prisons, courts, or died in ways that demanded official notice. The silence surrounding Webster's early years reflects not mystery, but marginality. What survives instead is context, a social environment in which children were expected to work early, contribute quickly, and endure quietly. For girls born into poverty in mid-19th century Ireland, childhood was brief and functional. Domestic labor began young, often first within the household and then beyond it. Service in other people's homes was common, sometimes informal at first and later contractual. Education, where it existed at all, was intermittent and subordinate to labor. Obedience was not simply a moral virtue, it was a survival skill. Girls who could not adapt to authority, routine, and restraint were exposed to harsher outcomes. Resistance carried consequences, but submission offered no guarantee of protection. The lesson imparted by such conditions was not that obedience would be rewarded, but that disobedience would be punished. The pressures that shaped Webster's early life were structural rather than exceptional. Hunger, overcrowding, instability, and displacement did not mark her as unusual. They marked her as representative of a generation shaped by economic collapse and colonial neglect. What would later distinguish her was not the presence of hardship, but her inability, or refusal, to disappear beneath it. Migration to England was one of the few available responses to these conditions. For Irish women, particularly young and unmarried ones, migration promised work in domestic service, a sector that required little formal training and offered wages alongside accommodation. Yet this promise was inseparable from risk. Irish migrants entered labor markets already saturated with servants and structured by prejudice. Irishness was frequently racialized in Victorian England. Irish women were associated in popular discourse with disorder, intemperance, and moral laxity. These assumptions shaped hiring practices and colored interpretations of behavior long before any conflict occurred. An English servant who argued might be described as impertinent. An Irish servant who did the same was more readily framed as dangerous. For a young woman like Webster, entering domestic service meant submitting not only to an employer, but to a regime that governed speech, movement, posture, and emotion. Servants lived inside their employers' homes, under constant observation. Correction was expected. Complaint was not. The ability to absorb humiliation without visible resistance was treated as evidence of moral fitness. There is no evidence that Kate Webster possessed this capacity for quiet endurance. Her later employment history suggests persistent difficulty adapting to sustained obedience. It is reasonable to locate the origins of this difficulty early, not as pathology, but as mismatch. Domestic service demanded a form of self-regulation and self-erasure that some women, particularly those raised amid instability rather than discipline, found intolerable. Webster's early life unfolded in a world where authority was both intimate and arbitrary. Power was exercised directly and often without explanation or appeal. Employers, landowners, officials, and police represented different faces of the same structure, command without accountability. For children and young women, resistance invited punishment, but compliance offered no security. Obedience could delay harm, but it could not prevent it. By the time Webster reached adulthood, she had already crossed multiple boundaries, geographical, social, and institutional. She had left Ireland for England. She had moved between households. She had encountered authority in its various forms: employers, police officers, magistrates. These encounters did not teach her how to belong. They taught her how to endure scrutiny. What her childhood did not provide was insulation. There was no family wealth to absorb failure, no stable community to mitigate reputation, no reserve of goodwill to soften dismissal. Each misstep carried weight. Each accusation lingered. Each loss of employment narrowed future options. Survival required constant recalibration. This absence of insulation matters because it shaped how Webster's later actions were interpreted. Behavior that might have been corrected or overlooked in a servant with social capital hardened quickly into evidence of character in someone without it. Early life did not determine her actions, but it determined the margin for error she was allowed. Chapter 2: Service, Dismissal, and Reputation. By the time Kate Webster entered regular domestic service in England, she was already subject to a form of surveillance that extended far beyond the merits of her labor. Service was not simply employment, it was a moral apprenticeship conducted inside private households. Employers evaluated not only competence but disposition, gratitude, composure, silence, and they judged these qualities continuously, often informally and without record. A raised eyebrow, an audible sigh, or a belated reply could weigh as heavily as a broken plate. Dismissal might be triggered as easily by tone as by theft, and once dismissal occurred, it traveled ahead of a servant like a shadow. The domestic character system and the cost of being believed. Victorian service was organized through what employers called character. A character was more than a reference, it was a portable certificate of moral worth, used to predict behavior as much as performance. Registry offices, lodging housekeepers, and informal neighborhood networks all acted as conduits for these judgments. In theory, a sequence of good characters could carry a woman from scullery to higher-waged posts. In practice, a single equivocal line, honest but prone to answer back, could halt advancement indefinitely. The system's promise of upward mobility depended on stability few servants genuinely enjoyed. A woman who moved frequently, who lacked a stable sponsor, or who had ever fallen into the police courts entered each interview with reputational debt she could not readily discharge. For Irish migrants, the character system was further skewed by prejudice. Accent, Catholic affiliation, and poverty were read as signals. Irishness itself could be treated as a deficit in trust, and the burden of proof fell upon the applicant, to demonstrate submission in advance, to reassure constantly, to accept correction without reply. This was not a legal requirement but a social one, embedded in the daily practice of hiring. A small failure of deference could be read as evidence of larger danger. Early life carried forward, from famine aftermath to house rule. Webster's formative years in Ireland were shaped by scarcity, displacement, and the fragmentary households that followed famine. Children in such conditions learned work early, spinning, scouring, tending younger siblings, and they often learned it in environments where instruction arrived as command rather than as apprenticeship. Submission was instrumental, not internalized, a way to avoid punishment, not a pathway to belonging. When such a child became a young woman in service, the gap between enforced obedience and inhabited obedience mattered. Where domestic service demanded the performance of easeful deference, what Webster had learned was watchfulness, guardedness, and argument as self-defense. The archival record for her specific childhood is sparse, yet the patterns it leaves, instability, migration, intermittent authority, align with a life that would later chafe at continuous correction. Migration rerouted these traits through unfamiliar streets. Like many Irish women, Webster likely entered England through port cities whose economies ran on transient labor and cheap lodging houses. There she would have encountered registry offices that promised placement, for a fee paid out of wages yet to come, and employers who measured propriety by silence. The discipline that service required was intimate and total. The body itself was scheduled, from waking to the hour of walking out, from posture at table to the angle of the head when being reprimanded. Failure to present docility was not a small flaw, it was the wrong manner of being in a house. Behaviour became evidence, the escalation of minor conflict. Webster's interactions with employers followed a pattern visible only when read together rather than in isolation. She did not fail quietly. She argued. She answered back. She resisted correction. These behaviors were recorded and repeated, often retrospectively, as self-confirming proofs. Former employer Mrs. Porter later described Webster as violent in temper and difficult to control, an account offered after the murder but consonant with earlier descriptions of insolence and unmanageability that were treated as sufficient cause for discharge even where no offense could be substantiated. Behavior itself became evidence. Accusation hardened into character. This is not to suggest that employers were uniquely malicious. Their authority was normalized and made necessary by the structure of the household economy. A servant who disrupted rhythm threatened more than comfort. She imperiled the mistress's reputation for domestic order, a public credential on which credit, tenancy, and social standing could depend. Correction therefore arrived quickly, often publicly within the household, and the servant was expected to absorb the humiliation without visible resentment. Where that expectation failed, as it repeatedly did for Webster, the relationship turned adversarial and dismissal followed. Theft at the margins, survival, resentment, and the criminal trace. When theft occurred in such settings, it was rarely grand. A sovereign here, a warm shawl there, a pair of boots exchanged for rent, small household items that could be turned into food. Webster faced both accusation and prosecution at different points. Some charges resulted in sentences, others in dismissal without court. The distinction mattered little to the future. For a servant, accusation alone could function as conviction in the labor market, and a short sentence, meant to correct, became a permanent stain in the registry office ledger and in the whispered exchanges between mistresses. Even where theft was unproven, suspicion could be enough to shift a woman downward into households that prized firmness above forbearance, multiplying the conditions under which conflict would recur. Here again, early life mattered. A childhood in which authority was arbitrary teaches that possession is contingent and that denial is routine. Small takings in adulthood can register not merely as greed but as recompense, a countergesture against a world that withholds. None of this justifies theft. It clarifies the ethics that animate it under pressure. In Webster's case, the archival fragments point to multiple dismissals and to police court appearances that left administrative traces without offering repair. Each trace narrowed her future service possibilities. The gendered body at work, intimacy without authority. Domestic service made a servant's body both proximate and subordinate. She slept under an employer's roof, prepared food she would not eat, handled garments she could not afford, cleaned rooms she could not enter at will. The work was intimate without authority, and the proximity itself intensified surveillance. Employers read fatigue as sullenness, illness as shirk, and quiet as sulk unless it presented as cheerful compliance. For women who had learned to guard themselves in unstable homes and hostile streets, the smiling transparency that service demanded could feel impossible to produce, especially under constant threat of summary dismissal. Motherhood compounded these pressures. The record indicates that Webster bore at least one child, although details are scarce. To remain in service, many women placed children with relatives, foster carers, or institutions, sometimes temporarily and sometimes permanently. Victorian documents treat these separations as administrative facts. They were in reality emotional amputations. For a woman already struggling to sustain composure under supervision, the additional grief and logistics of motherhood under poverty hardened the daily strain. Registry offices, lodging houses, and the arithmetic of dismissal. Even without formal prosecution, dismissal itself had arithmetic. Wages were lost immediately, lodging was lost the same day. A woman without savings entered the circuit of short lets, weekly rents, the pawn shop, and the chance of another place through a registry office. Registry fees, small to a householder, were large to a servant, and they were payable whether the place lasted a year or a week. Every failed placement thus converted money into lost time and renewed debt. Employers, meanwhile, drew on a surplus of applicants to reset the household order. What presented to the mistress as managerial prudence presented to the servant as an ever steeper hill. Webster's path through this landscape was predictable in its mechanics if not in its outcomes. Dismissals accumulated. References grew tepid or ceased to be issued. Informal warnings circulated, insolent, sharp-tongued, quarrelsome. The next mistress hired with a firmer hand, and the next conflict began earlier. Police involvement translated private difficulty into public stigma. Even a short sentence functioned like a brand. Respectability, religion, and the ethnic script assigned to Irish servants. Irish Catholic women entered English homes carrying externally legible signs, speech, parish, surname, that employers and neighbors read as proxies for temperament. Drink, disorder, and violence were the stock accusations. Docility was the demanded counter-performance. Within this script, the Irish servant who asserted herself confirmed the caricature. The risk for Webster, already inclined to argue, was that each assertion amplified the ethnic story told about her. Once mapped onto that story, resistance ceased to be a situational response and became an essence. She is that sort of woman. The role of the mistress in this dynamic was not incidental. Smaller households, like the one Webster would later enter in Richmond, concentrated authority in a single figure and removed mitigating intermediaries, older servants, adult sons, or a husband willing to ignore minor frictions. Corrections came undiluted, and the demand for deference was precise. What a larger establishment might have buffered as difficult, a widow's tight household experienced as intolerable. Firmness will do, the spiral towards stricter households. As Webster's record thickened with dismissal and doubt, her range of potential places contracted to households that believed in discipline as cure. Such employers, often praised by neighbors as particular and upright, saw themselves not as punitive but as restorative, as offering moral order to a servant who had known too little of it. In practice, correction arrived faster and in sharper tones. For a woman trained by scarcity to reply rather than submit, this combination was volatile. What began as raised voices soon became ultimatums, and when ultimatums were defied, dismissal followed without reference. The cycle then repeated, each turn tighter than the last. Early contacts with the police courts, short sentences, long shadows. Webster's occasional appearances before magistrates for theft or disorderly conduct registered the legal system's lightest touch, brief confinement, small fines, yet left the heaviest cultural mark. Employers read police involvement as disqualifying even where courts had been lenient. The paradox was cruel but consistent. The state could forgive what the household would not. And where the household would not forgive, the marketplace would not forget. Each encounter with authority thus ended with Webster returned to the same street, now carrying one more reason to be turned away at the door. The narrowing path to Richmond. By her late 30s, age worked against Webster. So did repetition. Households that wanted pliable bodies and cheerful deference preferred younger women whose histories were brief. Webster's past walked into each interview ahead of her, sometimes as gossip, sometimes as a cautiously worded character. She could not choose households, they chose her, if at all. It was under such conditions that she accepted the position with Julia Martha Thomas in Richmond. That she was hired at all indicates not indulgence but necessity. Mrs. Thomas required help and believed that order, firmly applied, would produce obedience. The household was small, the expectations exacting, the tolerance for defiance minimal. These were admired qualities in a mistress and a risk for a servant like Webster. Inside that house, the familiar pattern hardened quickly. Webster did not accept correction quietly. Mrs. Thomas corrected frequently. Arguments were audible to neighbors. Threats of dismissal followed. Whether those threats were proportionate is undecidable at this distance. What matters is that both women occupied their positions fully. One exercised institutional authority, the other met it with proximity and reply. In a system that depended on one-way obedience, this was not a sustainable relation. Reputation as destiny, and as misreading. It is tempting to read Webster's record as a straight line pointing toward catastrophe. That temptation should be resisted. Repetition does not equal inevitability. What the record shows, rather, is a woman transacting within a labor market that punished visible resistance more harshly than small thefts, that converted accusation into permanent disadvantage, and that treated a servant's voice, if it rose at the wrong moment, as an assault on the moral economy of the house. Within such a system, insolence became a catch-all category, a word that collapsed frustration, fear, pride, and fatigue into a single condemnation. Webster lived under that word, and she sometimes earned it. She did not, however, invent the structure that made the word decisive. Early life, revisited, what migration did, and did not change. Returning once more to Webster's early years clarifies what migration could not repair. Scarcity had trained her to expect sudden loss. Authority had appeared in her life as command without explanation. Work had been necessary and precarious in equal measure. England offered wages and a roof. It did not offer insulation from dismissal, nor did it supply the social buffers, patronage, kin with means, a community stable enough to absorb failure, that make correction survivable. The habits that preserved her in childhood, watchfulness, readiness to argue, refusal to collapse, worked poorly in a space that demanded transparent deference. Thus the very traits that had kept her alive could look, in a mistress's parlor, like proof that she did not deserve to remain. The precipice before the fall. When Webster stood on the edge of dismissal in Richmond, she was not experiencing an ordinary employment setback. She was approaching the loss of wages, housing, and whatever remained of her hireable name, all at once and in a city where reputation traveled quickly. For Mrs. Thomas, dismissal represented the reassertion of order. For Webster, it was a cliff. That imbalance of consequence mattered more than the immediate quarrel. It formed the ground on which the quarrel stood. None of this makes violence inevitable. It explains why obedience for Webster had become less a moral duty than an intolerable demand, and why the line between endurance and refusal had grown thin. Transition. The chapters that follow trace the moment when that line broke and what Webster did in its aftermath. But the conditions for rupture were set here, in a labor system that equated silence with virtue, in a hiring infrastructure that turned suspicion into destiny, and in a life whose early lessons made certain forms of submission feel like erasure rather than survival. What happened in Richmond cannot be understood apart from these forces, and from the long shadow cast by a childhood the archive did not deem worthy of detail. Chapter 3, Relationships, Intimacy, and Motherhood. Kate Webster's intimate life appears in the historical record only intermittently, and almost always obliquely. Like many poor women of her class, her relationships were not preserved as narratives of attachment or care, but surfaced only when they intersected with crime, dependency, or moral judgment. What survives is fragmentary and shaped by institutional priorities that treated intimacy as either irrelevant or suspect. Yet even in this partial record, a consistent pattern emerges. Relationships did not function as refuge. They were another site of instability. For women in Webster's position, intimacy was rarely separable from survival. Employment, housing, and personal relationships overlapped in ways that made emotional life structurally precarious. A servant who lost her place might rely temporarily on a partner for shelter. A woman who became pregnant might seek protection through cohabitation. These arrangements were not aberrations. They were strategies within a social order that offered poor women few independent means of stability. Marriage, the institution most likely to confer legal and social security, appears not to have been available to Webster. Whether through circumstance, exclusion, or choice, she remained unmarried. This absence mattered. Marriage transformed a woman's legal identity, her claims on property, and her moral standing. An unmarried woman with a child, by contrast, carried heightened scrutiny. Sexual respectability, already classed, became racialized and moralist further when combined with poverty and Irishness. The record indicates that Webster bore at least one child. The details are scant. The child's name, age, and fate are not clearly preserved. This silence is itself significant. Victorian courts and newspapers showed little interest in the children of accused women unless those children could be mobilized rhetorically, either as proof of unnatural motherhood or as victims requiring rescue. Ordinary maternal labor, attachment, and loss were not documented. Absence of evidence has too often been mistaken for absence of feeling. Motherhood under conditions of domestic service was extraordinarily difficult. Servants were expected to live in, to be available at all hours, and to subordinate personal obligations entirely to the household. Employers rarely tolerated children, and few made allowances for maternal needs. Women who bore children while in service were frequently forced to separate from them, placing them with relatives, foster carers, or charitable institutions. These arrangements were often temporary in intention and permanent in outcome. For a woman whose own childhood had been shaped by displacement and instability, such separations would not have been unfamiliar. Yet familiarity does not equal ease. Early exposure to disrupted households did not inoculate women against loss, it normalized it. Motherhood, in this context, did not anchor Webster. It compounded her vulnerability, adding emotional strain to an already precarious existence. Relationships with men offered no reliable alternative. Among the urban poor, male partners were themselves subject to irregular employment, illness, and incarceration. Dependency on such relationships exposed women to abandonment and violence without providing legal or material security. Cohabitation without marriage offered shelter but little protection. When relationships ended, as many did, the consequences fell disproportionately on women. There is little evidence that Webster's relationships moderated her conflicts with authority or softened her interactions with employers. If anything, they intensified pressure. The need to secure income while managing pregnancy or separation sharpened strain rather than relieving it. Emotional labor was required not only in intimate relationships, but in the constant recalibration of survival strategies. Victorian moral discourse framed women's sexuality as both fragile and dangerous. Poor women, particularly Irish women, were assumed to be morally suspect. Motherhood outside marriage confirmed these assumptions in the eyes of employers, police, and magistrates. A servant who was known or suspected to have a child faced heightened scrutiny. Respectability was conditional and easily revoked. This moral framing shaped how Webster was interpreted at every institutional encounter. Motherhood did not humanize her in the eyes of authority. It compounded suspicion. A woman who failed to conform to sexual norms was assumed to fail elsewhere as well. Insolence at work could be read as moral disorder. Argument became evidence of depravity rather than distress. The record does not preserve Webster's voice regarding her child or children. There are no letters, no recorded expressions of grief or attachment. This silence should not be mistaken for emotional absence. It reflects the priorities of the archive. Institutions recorded what threatened order, not what sustained life. The emotional interiority of poor women rarely survived unless it could be weaponized. What emerges instead is a picture of intimacy constrained by necessity. Relationships were formed under pressure and dissolved under strain. Motherhood intensified obligation without increasing protection. The boundaries between employment, housing, and intimacy blurred in ways that increased risk rather than reducing it. These conditions also shaped Webster's responses to authority. A woman who had already lost access to her child, or who lived with the constant possibility of such loss, had little incentive to perform patience indefinitely. The moral economy of domestic service assumed that servants would internalize obedience because they had something to lose. For women like Webster, loss was already a familiar state. By the late 1870s, Webster's personal life offered little stability. Relationships did not provide refuge from work. Work did not provide refuge from scrutiny. The separation between private and public life, so often assumed in Victorian ideology, did not exist for her. Every sphere overlapped, and failure in one cascaded into the others. This matters because it frames the final months before the murder not as a sudden rupture, but as an intensification. Webster entered her last employment already strained, already isolated, and already accustomed to managing pressure without support. The emotional reserves required for sustained submission were depleted. Her emotional world was not empty. It was crowded with obligation, fear of exclusion, and the accumulated weight of losses that had never been acknowledged as losses at all. None of this explains the violence that followed. It does, however, clarify the conditions under which authority, once seized, would not be relinquished easily. The house in Richmond would offer Webster something she had not possessed for years: shelter without supervision, authority without correction, and the illusion, brief, dangerous, and unsustainable, that obedience could be reversed. The desire to remain there did not arise solely from opportunism. It arose from a life in which remaining had always been the hardest thing to secure. Chapter 4: Julia Martha Thomas. Julia Martha Thomas occupied a position that Victorian society understood with particular clarity and invested with significant moral weight. She was a widow of modest but sufficient means, living independently in Richmond, a suburb associated with order, respectability, and aspirational comfort. Her life was not marked by luxury. It was marked by management. Widowhood in 19th-century England was a legally recognized but socially precarious state. A widow stood apart from the structures that governed married women, no longer subject to a husband's authority, yet still constrained by expectations of feminine propriety. She could own property, manage finances, and employ servants, but her independence was conditional. It rested on visible respectability. Any suggestion of disorder, financial, domestic, or moral, threatened her position. Mrs. Thomas had been married to Captain Thomas, an officer in the Indian Army. His death placed her among a substantial class of women who survived on pensions, investments, and careful household management. Such women were neither poor nor secure. They relied on vigilance, thrift, and reputation to sustain independence. Domestic order was not simply a preference. It was an economic necessity. For widows of this class, the household became the primary site through which respectability was demonstrated and defended. The cleanliness of rooms, the regularity of meals, the conduct of servants, and the absence of scandal all functioned as public signals of moral competence. A well-managed household was evidence of a well-governed self. Servants were therefore not merely employees. They were extensions of their employer's moral standing. A servant who argued, behaved irregularly, or attracted police attention compromised more than efficiency. She compromised reputation. In a society that closely scrutinized women living without male protection, such compromise carried disproportionate risk. Mrs. Thomas's home in Richmond reflected this logic. It was not grand, but it was orderly. She employed domestic help not as a luxury, but as a means of maintaining the routines that signaled propriety. Testimony and contemporary descriptions portray her as strict, particular, and morally exacting. These qualities were admired rather than criticized. In Victorian domestic ideology, firmness was a virtue, especially in a woman responsible for managing a household alone. The authority Mrs. Thomas exercised over her servants was absolute within the domestic sphere. She controlled wages, food, shelter, and dismissal. She issued correction and expected compliance. This authority was not idiosyncratic. It was socially sanctioned, legally supported, and culturally reinforced. A mistress who failed to assert control over her household risked being seen as weak, indulgent, or morally lax. Widowhood intensified this imperative. Without a husband to absorb conflict or share blame, a widow bore sole responsibility for the conduct of her household. Disorder reflected directly upon her. Leniency toward servants could be interpreted as inability to govern. Mrs. Thomas's exacting standards were therefore not merely personal traits. They were defensive practices within a narrow margin of respectability. The employment of servants by widows was common and fraught. Servants provided labor and companionship, but also introduced intimacy into spaces where authority needed to remain unmistakable. Familiarity risked eroding hierarchy. For women like Mrs. Thomas, distance was a form of protection. When Mrs. Thomas hired Kate Webster, the decision was likely pragmatic rather than indulgent. Servant turnover was high, and suitable candidates were not always available. Employers often accepted servants with imperfect records, believing that firmness would ensure compliance. This belief was widespread and rarely questioned. Disorder was understood as correctable through discipline. The early weeks of Webster's employment appear to have confirmed Mrs. Thomas's concerns. Testimony later suggested frequent dissatisfaction, reprimands, and arguments. Mrs. Thomas corrected Webster openly and repeatedly. Webster responded audibly and with resistance. Each woman interpreted the other's behavior through the lens of her role. Mrs. Thomas saw insubordination. Webster saw hostility and threat. This dynamic hardened quickly. In a small household without intermediaries, conflict had no buffer. There were no senior servants to mediate, no family members to diffuse tension. Authority and resistance met directly, repeatedly, and without softening. Mrs. Thomas's authority was legitimate and supported by the system in which she lived. Yet it was also fragile. It depended on compliance. The threat of dismissal functioned as her ultimate instrument of control. For Mrs. Thomas, dismissal was a managerial act, a means of restoring order. For Webster, it represented immediate crisis. The imbalance of consequence was profound. Mrs. Thomas would lose a servant and hire another. Webster would lose wages, housing, and whatever remained of her employable reputation. This asymmetry structured every interaction between them, whether consciously acknowledged or not. By the late winter of 1879, Mrs. Thomas had reportedly decided to dismiss Webster. The precise wording and timing of this decision are uncertain, filtered through later testimony. What is clear is that dismissal was imminent. For Mrs. Thomas, this was an assertion of authority exercised in accordance with social norms. For Webster, it was the collapse of the last viable structure supporting her survival. The household had become a site of irreconcilable authority. Mrs. Thomas embodied a form of power that depended on obedience to remain intact. Webster faced a future in which obedience no longer offered protection. Neither woman retreated from her position. It is important to resist caricature here. Mrs. Thomas was not unusually cruel. She did not step outside the bounds of acceptable conduct. She acted as a respectable widow was expected to act, maintaining order, correcting servants, and defending her household against perceived disorder. The system affirmed her actions at every turn. Yet the very legitimacy of her authority magnified the consequences when it failed. Victorian domestic ideology assumed that power flowed downward and would never be reversed. It assumed that servants would leave when told to leave. It assumed that violence would never move upward. When that assumption collapsed, the shock was not merely personal. It was structural. Mrs. Thomas's death would later be framed as the destruction of innocence and order. In life, she represented neither sentimentality nor indulgence, but a disciplined form of female authority that Victorian society depended upon yet rarely examined. Her household was not an aberration. It was exemplary. The conflict between Julia Martha Thomas and Kate Webster was therefore not simply interpersonal. It was the collision of two women positioned at opposite ends of the same system, one tasked with enforcing obedience, the other exhausted by it. The house in Richmond did not merely contain that collision. It produced it. Chapter 5. The Last Employment. When Kate Webster entered the household of Julia Martha Thomas in early 1879, the arrangement was fragile from its inception. It was not simply another place of service. It was the convergence point of two lives already under strain, shaped by opposing but equally unforgiving demands. From the beginning, the household carried the weight of mutual dissatisfaction. Mrs. Thomas required order, obedience, and deference in order to sustain her independence and respectability as a widow. Webster required employment, shelter, and time. Their needs overlapped only superficially. What each woman required most from the arrangement was precisely what the other could not safely concede. The household routine was exacting. Mrs. Thomas expected tasks to be completed promptly, visibly, and to her standard. Correction was frequent and direct. Webster was not granted the latitude sometimes extended to younger or more pliable servants. She was watched closely. Her movements, speech, and manner were subject to continual evaluation. This scrutiny was not unusual within domestic service, but it had particular intensity in a small household governed by a single authority figure. Rather than producing compliance, scrutiny sharpened resentment. Correction arrived not as instruction but as judgment. Each reprimand reinforced the imbalance of power that structured the relationship. Mrs. Thomas corrected because correction was her responsibility. Webster resisted because submission had repeatedly failed to secure her survival elsewhere. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices from the house. Arguments were not constant, but they were memorable. Such exchanges violated expectations on both sides. A servant was expected to accept rebuke quietly. A mistress was expected to maintain composure. The audible breakdown of this performance signaled a deeper failure of authority, one that could not be resolved through minor adjustment. The record suggests that Mrs. Thomas complained repeatedly of Webster's conduct. Webster was accused of insolence, neglect, and disrespect. Whether these accusations were proportionate cannot be determined. What matters is that they accumulated. In a domestic hierarchy, repeated correction without visible reform led toward dismissal. Dismissal was not merely possible. It became probable. For Mrs. Thomas, dismissal was a managerial act. It restored order. It demonstrated control. It signaled to neighbors and to herself that her household remained governed. For Webster, dismissal represented collapse. It meant immediate loss of wages and shelter, and further erosion of a reputation already weakened by years of dismissal and police contact. This asymmetry structured the emotional climate of the household in its final weeks. Mrs. Thomas occupied a position of confidence. Webster occupied a position of impending crisis. Each interaction carried disproportionate weight. Each correction echoed beyond the moment itself. By late winter of 1879, dismissal was no longer a distant possibility. Testimony later indicated that Mrs. Thomas had made her intention clear. The precise phrasing and timing are uncertain, filtered through recollection and reporting, but the certainty of outcome is not. Webster knew she was about to lose her place. The significance of this knowledge cannot be overstated. For Mrs. Thomas, dismissal would be inconvenient but manageable. For Webster, it threatened immediate destitution. At her age, with her record, and with her history of conflict, re-entry into service was uncertain at best. Dismissal did not merely end a job. It narrowed the future. The house itself became charged with this knowledge. Ordinary tasks were performed under extraordinary pressure. Silence became fraught. Speech became dangerous. Each woman interpreted the other's actions through the lens of imminent separation. Mrs. Thomas asserted authority more firmly. Webster experienced each assertion as confirmation that obedience would not save her. The argument that ended in violence was not unique in form. Raised voices had been heard before. What distinguished this encounter was the finality of its context. There was no longer room for delay, negotiation, or endurance. The system's usual resolution, dismissal and disappearance, was imminent. On the day of the murder, Mrs. Thomas and Webster were alone in the house. The setting was ordinary. There is no evidence of elaborate planning or premeditated flight. What occurred was sudden, violent, and irreversible. During an argument, Webster struck Mrs. Thomas. The blow was delivered with sufficient force to knock her to the ground. Medical testimony later established that Mrs. Thomas sustained fatal injuries to the head. The violence did not end with a single strike. It was sustained. Mrs. Thomas was beaten repeatedly. When it ended, she was dead. This was not an act of defense. It was not accidental. It was overwhelming. The imbalance of power that had governed the household inverted in an instant, but the violence that followed did not restore equilibrium. It annihilated it. What followed distinguishes this crime from many others committed within domestic service. Webster did not flee. She did not raise an alarm. She did not immediately attempt to erase herself from the scene. Instead, she acted to remain. The house did not become, in her mind, a site of immediate escape. It became a resource. In the hours after the killing, Webster began to dismantle the boundary between servant and mistress. She changed clothes. She moved through the house freely. She assumed the rhythms of occupancy rather than labor. This was not mere concealment. It was replacement. For several days, Webster inhabited the house as though it were her own. She answered the door. She spoke to neighbors. She offered explanations for Mrs. Thomas's absence. She sold property belonging to the household. She wore her employer's clothing openly. The performance was imperfect, but it was sustained. This decision required composure and familiarity. Webster knew the house. She knew its routines. She knew how Mrs. Thomas was seen by neighbors and tradespeople. She understood which absences would provoke concern and which could be explained away. Years of living under surveillance had taught her how to perform acceptability. The duration of this occupation was brief, but its significance was profound. Even a temporary assumption of authority violated deeply held assumptions about class and domestic order. Servants did not remain. They did not occupy. They did not replace. The boldness of Webster's actions contributed to their undoing. Goods were sold too openly. Stories shifted. Neighbors noticed inconsistencies. The boundary she attempted to inhabit was too narrow to sustain. When suspicion hardened, it did so quickly. The body was discovered. Evidence accumulated. The house transformed from a space of substitution into a site of exposure. Only then did Webster flee. Flight came not as a first instinct, but as a last resort. By the time she left Richmond, the opportunity to disappear quietly had passed. The last employment ended not in dismissal, but in death. The structure that had governed Webster's adult life, obedience enforced by expulsion, collapsed violently. What followed would be public, relentless, and final. The violence that ended Julia Martha Thomas's life did not immediately produce flight, confession, or discovery. What followed the final blow was not resolution but suspension. For a brief interval, the ordinary mechanisms that governed domestic service ceased to function. There was no dismissal issued, no departure taken, no appeal made to neighbors or authorities. The household did not dissolve in the expected manner. Instead, it remained, occupied, ordered, and outwardly intact. This pause matters. Victorian domestic hierarchy relied on predictability. Conflict ended with expulsion. Authority reasserted itself through disappearance. The servant left, the house endured. What occurred in Richmond disrupted that sequence. The household did not expel its servant. The servant remained, and in remaining, crossed a boundary that domestic ideology insisted could not be crossed. The murder was an act of violence. What followed was an act of management. In the hours after Mrs. Thomas's death, the house became a space of decision rather than escape. The question Webster faced was not only how to avoid detection, but whether disappearance was still possible at all. Years of dismissal had taught her what expulsion looked like. She had lived the consequences repeatedly. To leave was to return to precarity. To remain was to risk exposure. She chose to remain. That choice shifted the meaning of what had occurred. The killing did not close the conflict between mistress and servant, it inverted it. Authority did not vanish with Mrs. Thomas's death. It was seized, briefly and imperfectly, by the woman who had been governed by it. The house did not become empty. It was occupied. This occupation did not rely on deception alone. It relied on familiarity, on Webster's knowledge of the rhythms, expectations, and silences that structured respectable domestic life. She knew how absence might be explained, how goods could be sold without immediate alarm, how authority was performed in small habitual gestures. The very surveillance that had disciplined her now enabled her. The danger of this reversal lay not only in its illegitimacy, but in its visibility. A servant who fled could be forgotten. A servant who stayed risked being seen. The days that followed would expose the limits of substitution. Stories would fracture. Objects would circulate too widely. Bodies, even when hidden, would refuse to disappear quietly. What had been a private struggle over obedience and dismissal would become a public reckoning. What had been contained within the walls of a single house would soon be dismantled, catalogued, and displayed. The domestic space that had enabled concealment would become a site of forensic reconstruction. Authority would move from the household to the court, from private correction to public certainty. Chapter 6: The Killing and the Body. Forensic reconstruction, from discovery to certainty. The body did not remain hidden because it could not. The concealment failed at the point where private decisions intersected with public labor. Remains surfaced not through a targeted search, but as a byproduct of ordinary work. Men engaged in routine handling of refuse encountered what should not have been there, and their interruptions summoned the state. In that instant, private violence began its translation into public fact. From the perspective of Victorian procedure, the path from encounter to certainty followed a recognizable rhythm. First, identification of kind. Medical eyes established that the finds were human. Second, aggregation of fragments. Additional discoveries, made by others while performing everyday tasks, accumulated into a pattern that defeated coincidence. Third, vector tracing. Movement backward along routes of refuse and habit drew attention toward the source, toward a house newly marked by absence that had nonetheless continued to function as a household. The absence of Julia Martha Thomas, untroubling in isolation, became urgent once paired with remains that announced a specific missing person. Inside the house, once entered, domestic traces hardened into evidence. Smudges, burns, displaced objects, and the awkward choreography of hastily improvised tasks contradicted the performance of normalcy. The same rooms that enabled occupation now yielded a record of it. When read together, these signs made concealment legible as an activity rather than a void. What followed procedurally was standard for serious violence: a coroner's inquest to stabilize the preliminary narrative, followed by medical testimony that translated injury into cause and sequence, and the police consolidation of a chain of objects, clothing, goods, and the material debris of hurried disposal, that stitched household to body. Press interest, already acute, amplified the movement from conjecture to conclusion. Illustrations and summaries condensed the case for readers who would never see the rooms or the remains themselves. The medical voice, establishing cause, sequence, and intent. Victorian courts distrusted motive when unsupported by the body's testimony. Physicians and surgeons offered that testimony in a register deliberately prosaic. Injury was described, not dramatized. Sequence was inferred from relative damage and from what decomposition, heat, or cutting could and could not obscure. In Webster's case, the medical story did not dwell on psychology. It made 3 points that the law could use. Lethality, blows to the head sufficient to kill, not defensive, not accidental in their aggregate effect. The violence was decisive rather than incidental. After-death handling, post-mortem actions distinguished from ante-mortem injury, marks of movement, dismemberment, and attempted destruction, shifting focus from quarrel to management. Temporal compression, the narrow interval between death and concealment implied composure under pressure. The house moved quickly from scene of violence to workshop of erasure. The clinical understatement of such testimony did powerful rhetorical work. By refusing speculation and attending only to what the body could show, medical witnesses made alternative narratives: panic, accident, irresistible provocation, appear extraneous. The court thus received not simply facts, but permission to treat character evidence and post-mortem treatment as decisive inferences of intent. Chain of custody, chain of meaning. If medical witnesses stabilized the how, police labor stabilized the whos. Clothing sold too openly, goods circulating with implausible explanations, neighbors recalling changes of dress and habit, all of these formed a chain of custody in the legal sense and a chain of meaning in the cultural one. Each item linked the respectable household of a widow to the continuing presence of her servant. Each sale created a new witness, each witness narrowed narrative possibilities. What had seemed bold substitution became, under evidentiary light, a trail of involuntary confession. By the time Webster fled, forensic momentum exceeded her speed. The finds had already directed attention to the house had already yielded its contradictions, the neighborhood had already rehearsed its testimony. Arrest abroad only completed a story the remains had already told. Inquest vignette. The inquest did not begin with accusation. It began with arrangement. The room was ordinary, borrowed for the purpose, its familiarity lending authority to the proceedings. The coroner sat at a small table. Jurors, local men, respectable, attentive, were sworn. What lay before them was not the story of a household, but the fragments of a body whose presence demanded explanation. Witnesses spoke in turn. Workmen described their labor and its interruption. They did not speculate. They stated what they had found, where they had found it, and what they had done next. Medical men followed, careful with language, precise in sequence. They named injuries without embellishment. They separated what occurred before death from what occurred after. They did not speak of motive. The body was reconstructed verbally. Piece by piece, it was made legible. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. By the time the coroner summarized the evidence, absence had acquired weight. Julia Martha Thomas was not merely missing. She was required to be dead. The verdict did not name a killer. It did not need to. It named a condition: willful murder by person or persons unknown. From that moment, uncertainty narrowed. What had been inquiry became pursuit. Symbolic analysis, bodies, waste, and the inverted household. The corpse and the servant, two forms of containment. Victorian domestic ideology required containment, emotions regulated, labor concealed, bodies governed. In that moral geometry, the corpse, like the servant, was to remain in its place. The scandal of this case lies not simply in death, but in the double breach of placement. A servant occupied what should have been a mistress's space, and a mistress's body entered circuits of waste designed for ash and peelings, not for persons. The shock registered because both transgressions inverted the same hierarchy. The kitchen as threshold, from nurture to destruction. The kitchen and scullery were sites where raw matter became edible order. Heat, water, and repetitive labor converted the formless into the respectable. To use those same instruments, knife, fire, basin, toward concealment was to pervert a feminized technology of care into a technology of erasure. The symbolism struck Victorian observers with particular force. The room that signified a mistress's competence became the theater of her unmaking. The servant's ordinary tools acquired catastrophic meaning because they worked too well at a task they were never meant to perform. Waste as imagined disappearance. Concealment relied on a common 19th century faith in domestic waste systems as a kind of moral abyss. Fires were thought to obliterate, refuse routes to remove. This faith was partly warranted. Waste did make much disappear, but it was also performative. Out of sight became out of mind. In this case, the belief failed precisely because waste is a system of labor, not of magic. Men handled the bins, carts moved through streets, river and pit received what people put into them. The servant's hope in disappearance confronted another class's routine visibility. Remains did not betray themselves, work revealed them. Dismemberment and Victorian moral grammar. Courts could sometimes grant mitigating space to sudden violence between the living. They granted none to post-mortem violation. In the moral grammar of the period, dismemberment did not merely dispose of a body, it exposed an inner disorder that words like insolence or theft could never fully capture. It collapsed the distance between act and essence. A woman who cut a body apart must be the sort of woman for whom hierarchy no longer bound. Thus, once the remains surfaced, explanation narrowed. Quarrel receded, character advanced. The occupation of the house was reinterpreted not as desperate strategy but as proof. The servant's body and the mistress's body. Domestic service disciplined the servant's living body, where it could stand, how it should sound, when it could rest. The mistress's body, by contrast, was represented, clothed, protected, and abstracted into propriety. This case forced the protected body into material visibility and elevated the disciplined body into narrative centrality. Newspapers published sketches of Webster. Neighbors remembered her voice and clothes. The court arranged attention around the corpse. The social imagination could not hold both orders at once. It restored them by erasing the servant, through execution, and re-idealizing the mistress, through martyrdom to domestic order. House court, the migration of authority. Finally, the symbolic center of the case migrates from the house, where authority depended on consent and repetition, to the court, where authority depends on exposure. In the household, Mrs. Thomas's power required Webster's obedience. Once that obedience failed, the house faltered. In the courtroom, the state needed only the body and the witness. The very instruments that produced domestic hierarchy, routine, deference, privacy, were replaced by the instruments that enforce public hierarchy, evidence, procedure, sentence. What the house could not accomplish, a final expulsion, the court achieved with ritual certainty. From this point forward, the body no longer belonged to the house in Richmond. It had entered a different regime, one governed by examination, record, and display. What had been concealed through routine would now be exposed through procedure. The same domestic order that had once absorbed silence now produced evidence. Kate Webster's brief occupation of authority ended here. What followed was not uncertainty, but pursuit. Chapter 7, Discovery, Flight, and Capture. By the time the first remains were found, the logic of concealment had already failed. Discovery did not arrive through suspicion or confession. It arrived because ordinary labor was interrupted by what should not have been there. Workmen, engaged in routine handling of refuse, encountered human parts, their interruption summoned procedure, and procedure summoned the state. From that point, exposure moved faster than intention. The initial identification of the remains as human was followed by additional finds, each fragment refusing the comfort of coincidence. The route of waste became a line of return, drawing attention back toward the neighborhood from which it had come, and toward a house that was newly marked by absence yet stubbornly inhabited. Neighbors had not initially been alarmed by the widow's invisibility. Widows traveled, and silence could be explained. What unsettled them was the persistence of activity at her address. The door continued to open. A voice continued to answer it. The household, outwardly functional, no longer had a mistress. Objects began to circulate. Clothing recognizable as Mrs. Thomas's appeared on the body of her servant. Items left the house and entered shops, pawnbrokers, and private hands, generating witnesses with every sale. Each object that changed possession created another point of contact between the respectable address and the wider city. The more ordinary the item, the more eloquent it became. Goods that should have anchored a household now mapped its undoing. When the police entered the house, performance gave way to evidence. Stains, burns, displaced furnishings, and the awkward rearrangements of hastily improvised tasks contradicted the semblance of normal routine. In the same rooms where Webster had attempted occupation, the authorities read sequence, violence, handling, concealment, and the everyday gestures by which such actions had been briefly disguised. The domestic interior, whose purpose was to absorb labor and hide its marks, functioned now as an archive against its occupant. It was only after this interpretive machinery had gathered pace that Webster left Richmond. She moved north, then crossed to Ireland, motion born less of plan than of recognition that remaining was no longer tenable. Flight arrived last. She had already been seen, described, and connected by objects to a house the police now understood as a scene. Here the case entered a modern register. In an older world, distance could defeat memory, names could be altered, a new lodging could swallow a past. In the late 19th century, print and networked movement, rail, post, and the sea lanes of regular packets, traveled with a speed that outpaced the body. Newspaper coverage crossed the Irish Sea as a matter of routine. Descriptions circulated. The servant's image, sketched and reiterated, preceded her into towns where she had never been. She relied on ordinariness for cover. Ordinariness had already been described to strangers. Recognition did not come through betrayal, but through reading. Someone who had seen the reports recognized Webster without confrontation and passed the information forward. There is no evidence of struggle. The arrest, when it came, was unremarkable in form and decisive in consequence. It required no theatrics because the decisive act, the conversion of absence into certainty, had already occurred elsewhere. Returned under guard to England, Webster traveled through a landscape that now hosted her as narrative rather than as person. Newspapers reported her movements, translating logistics into spectacle and transforming the simple geography of return into public reassurance that the breach was being repaired. What had begun inside a single household now belonged to a public that consumed it in paragraphs, sketches, and court calendars. From the moment of her arrival, investigation yielded to preparation. Statements were formalized, witnesses organized, and items catalogued in a chain that linked rooms, objects, and actions without the need for motive. The state no longer needed to find a killer. It needed to present one. In this setting, Webster's admission that she had killed Mrs. Thomas mattered less than how the killing would be framed. She spoke of argument, fear of dismissal, and rage compressed by years of dismissal and correction. But such explanations could not compete with the eloquence of the body and the clarity of the household archive. The evidentiary story, violence, handling, sale, substitution, had already narrowed interpretation to a point. Public interest intensified as certainty hardened. The case made vivid a set of anxieties that Victorian domesticity preferred to keep quiet: the intimacy of service, the permeability of class boundaries, the possibility that authority relied on consent more than on force, and the shock when consent failed. Press narratives performed an act of repair in advance of the courts. By emphasizing brutality and impersonation, they recast the entire sequence as moral deviance rather than structural failure. By the time the indictment was read, judgment had been rehearsed outside the courtroom. What remained was not discovery, but adjudication. The house had failed to keep its hierarchy. The street had carried the evidence outward. The press had taught readers what to think. The court would now ratify what the body, the objects, and the neighborhood had already made plain. The pursuit ended where exposure had begun to speak for itself. The trial would not ask what happened. It would decide what it meant. Chapter 8: Arrest, Trial, and Condemnation. By the time Kate Webster was returned to England, the legal process had already assumed its outcome. The discovery of Julia Martha Thomas's remains, the reconstruction of the body, and the circulation of recognizable objects had transformed suspicion into certainty. The court would not decide what had happened. It would decide how to name it. Webster entered the trial process not as an unknown defendant, but as a figure already fixed in public imagination. Newspapers had rehearsed the narrative extensively. Illustrations circulated. Her appearance, demeanor, and past were discussed as though they constituted evidence in themselves. By the time proceedings began, judgment had been culturally prepared. The trial at the Central Criminal Court was crowded. Public interest was intense, not only because of the violence, but because of its setting. The crime had occurred within a respectable household. It involved a servant and her employer. This inversion of expected order framed every aspect of the proceedings. The prosecution's strategy was methodical and cumulative. It did not rely heavily on motive. Instead, it assembled sequence: argument, violence, concealment, occupation, discovery. Each stage was supported by witnesses whose testimony overlapped just enough to eliminate ambiguity. Medical evidence occupied a central place. Surgeons described injuries with clinical precision. They distinguished ante-mortem trauma from post-mortem handling. The sustained nature of the assault and the subsequent treatment of the body were presented as evidence of deliberation rather than panic. The jury was not asked to imagine. It was instructed to infer. Witnesses from the neighborhood followed. They described Webster's presence in the house after Mrs. Thomas's disappearance. They recalled explanations offered, doors opened, goods sold. These testimonies established continuity. Webster had not fled. She had remained, acted, and benefited. Former employers were introduced selectively. Mrs. Porter's account of Webster's temper and resistance to authority was not offered to explain the crime, but to frame it. Behavior once dismissed as troublesome became retrospectively diagnostic. The past was repurposed to stabilize the present. Webster did not deny killing Julia Martha Thomas. Her defense did not rest on innocence. She acknowledged the act and attempted to contextualize it. She spoke of argument, provocation, and fear of dismissal. She described a moment of rage rather than calculation. The court did not meaningfully engage with this explanation. Fear of dismissal was not recognized as coercive. Employment was treated as a privilege, not a necessity on which survival depended. Provocation carried little weight when the victim was a respectable widow and the defendant a servant. What ultimately foreclosed interpretation was the body. The dismemberment and disposal of Mrs. Thomas's remains eclipsed all preceding context. In Victorian legal culture, violence against a corpse carried a distinct moral charge. It signified not merely guilt, but moral disorder. Once the remains were displayed, verbally, materially, imaginatively, the space for mitigation collapsed. The judge's summing up reinforced this framing. The jury was directed to consider intent as demonstrated through conduct rather than emotion. The emphasis fell not on what Webster felt, but on what she did after the killing. The treatment of the body became the measure of culpability. The verdict was returned swiftly. Guilty. Sentence followed immediately. Death. The condemnation was ritualized and absolute. Webster's actions were described in language that exceeded legal necessity. She was framed as unnatural, depraved, and beyond redemption. This language did cultural work. It resolved the anxiety produced by her occupation of authority. It restored hierarchy by eliminating the figure who had breached it. Webster received the sentence without visible collapse. Contemporary accounts noted her composure. This composure was not read as endurance, but as further evidence of moral deficiency. Emotional restraint, in this context, functioned against her. There was no serious consideration of clemency. The case did not invite mercy. It demanded closure. The law did not need to understand Webster. It needed to end her. In condemning Kate Webster, the court did more than punish a killing. It repaired a breach. The servant who had occupied a mistress's place was removed from society altogether. Authority, momentarily exposed as fragile, was restored through finality. What remained was the body's lesson, and the state's obligation to complete it. Chapter 9: Execution and Afterlife. Execution was not an afterthought. It was the final act required to make the case mean what it was supposed to mean. Once sentence had been passed, the legal work of interpretation was complete. What remained was administrative certainty. Kate Webster was returned to custody to await execution under the regime applied to women condemned to death. Her days narrowed into routine. Movement was regulated. Speech was monitored. Contact with the outside world was limited. The state no longer required her as a subject of inquiry. It required her as an outcome. Victorian penal practice treated the interval between sentence and execution as a space of moral management rather than reflection. Condemned prisoners were attended by clergy, encouraged to repent, and observed closely for signs of appropriate contrition. These rituals were not designed to recover complexity or to revisit explanation. They existed to confirm that the condemned had been properly prepared, for death and for meaning. Accounts of Webster's conduct during this period emphasized composure. She was described as calm, reserved, and outwardly resigned. This composure attracted attention precisely because it resisted easy interpretation. Some observers read it as repentance achieved at last. Others read it as further proof of moral hardness. What it did not invite was sustained curiosity about her interior life. By this stage, her emotions were no longer relevant except insofar as they could be aligned with punishment. Reports of spiritual instruction appeared in the press, framed as evidence of the system's benevolence rather than the prisoner's transformation. Expressions of remorse, where reported, were paraphrased, filtered, and moralist. The condemned woman's voice did not re-enter the record on her own terms. It was ventriloquized through institutional expectation. Execution took place at Wandsworth Prison, under reforms that had removed executions from public view. The absence of a crowd did not diminish the event's symbolic force. Newspapers reported the timing, procedure, and demeanor with precision. The state demonstrated its authority without spectacle. Order was restored quietly. Kate Webster was hanged in July 1879. The sentence was carried out as planned. The act itself was brief. Its significance was not. With execution, the legal narrative closed. The cultural narrative accelerated. In the immediate aftermath, newspapers returned to the case with renewed intensity. Details of the crime were rehearsed. The treatment of the body was revisited. The impersonation was emphasized. Context thinned. What had once been a sequence of pressures, conflicts, and constrained choices hardened into a single defining act. Webster ceased to be a woman with a history. She became a warning. Press accounts fixated on inversion. The servant who wore her mistress's clothes. The woman who occupied a respectable home. The Irish migrant who violated domestic order. These images circulated repeatedly, stripped of surrounding detail until they achieved symbolic clarity. The complexity of her life was reduced to transgression. This reduction served a purpose. By framing Webster as an aberration, unnatural, monstrous, exceptional, the press reassured readers that the system itself remained sound. Violence was presented as deviation rather than consequence. Domestic service was not questioned. Authority was not examined. The breach was individualized and eliminated. Julia Martha Thomas, in contrast, was simplified in the opposite direction. Her life beyond the moment of death receded. Her careful management of widowhood, her reliance on domestic order, and her participation in a system that demanded obedience were subsumed into her role as victim. She became the embodiment of violated respectability rather than a woman navigating her own constraints. The pairing was efficient and enduring, monster and martyr. Later retellings followed the same pattern. Sensational accounts emphasized brutality and disguise. Psychological explanations were offered without evidence. Motive was flattened into depravity or madness. The long accumulation of pressure that preceded the crime was rarely acknowledged. Where explanation appeared, it functioned to seal rather than to open inquiry. What was lost in this afterlife was proportion. Kate Webster did not kill because she was uniquely violent. She killed within a system that demanded obedience without offering security, punished resistance without offering reintegration, and responded to transgression with symbolic force rather than understanding. This does not excuse the act. It situates it. The state's response to Webster was not limited to punishment for murder. It addressed something more unsettling, the exposure of authority as contingent. For several days, a servant had occupied a mistress's place. She had remained in the house. She had answered the door. She had spoken with the voice of authority. Even briefly, this reversal revealed the fragility of a hierarchy that relied on consent and routine rather than force. Execution resolved that exposure. By removing Webster permanently, the state reasserted the boundary she had crossed. The servant who stayed was erased. The lesson remained. Authority, once violated, would be restored absolutely. In this sense, Webster's death functioned less as retribution than as closure. It completed a process that began with occupation and moved through exposure and judgment toward erasure. The person was removed so that the system could endure unexamined. What survives of Kate Webster is therefore not her voice, her relationships, or her endurance. What survives is her function within a narrative designed to reassure. She became a symbol through which Victorian society resolved its anxieties about domestic intimacy, class proximity, and female defiance. This afterlife is not accidental. It is produced. To understand Kate Webster, then, is not to search for redemption or pathology. It is to recognize how thoroughly the system that condemned her had already failed to imagine any response other than elimination once its hierarchies were made visible. Her execution closed the case. It did not close the questions the case continues to raise. Conclusion. Kate Webster's case has endured not because it was anomalous, but because it revealed something Victorian society was unwilling to acknowledge about itself. The violence that ended Julia Martha Thomas's life was shocking, but it was not incomprehensible within the world that produced it. What proved intolerable was not simply the act of murder. It was the sequence that followed it. A servant did not flee. She remained. She occupied the house. She assumed, briefly and imperfectly, the outward forms of authority. That occupation exposed the contingency of a system that depended on obedience to appear natural. Domestic hierarchy functioned not through constant force, but through routine, consent, and the expectation that servants would internalize their own subordination. When that expectation failed, the system revealed its limits. This book has traced the path by which that failure was resolved. Kate Webster did not emerge suddenly as a figure of violence. Her life before Richmond was shaped by scarcity, displacement, and repeated expulsion. Domestic service demanded submission without offering security. Dismissal punished resistance without providing reintegration. Over time, obedience ceased to function as protection. What narrowed for Webster was not morality, but possibility. The killing of Julia Martha Thomas was a catastrophic act that cannot be excused or softened. A woman lost her life in her own home, violently and irrevocably. Yet the response to that act, legal, cultural, and historical, extended far beyond the harm itself. It transformed the crime into a lesson about order. Once the body was discovered, authority migrated decisively. The household could no longer contain what had occurred. The body entered forensic space, then judicial space, then symbolic space. Explanation narrowed as certainty hardened. The trial did not ask why Webster acted. It asked how her actions would be interpreted. The answer was fixed by the treatment of the body and by the inversion her occupation represented. Execution completed this process. It did not merely punish a crime. It erased a breach. The servant who had crossed the boundary between labor and authority was removed permanently. The system that had been momentarily exposed was restored without examination. What survived was not Kate Webster as a person, but Kate Webster as a warning. In the afterlife of the case, complexity was stripped away. Webster became an aberration, monstrous, unnatural, exceptional. Julia Martha Thomas became a symbol of violated respectability. This pairing resolved the narrative efficiently. It reassured Victorian society that violence was deviation rather than consequence, that domestic service remained sound, and that authority, when challenged, would be reasserted absolutely. This book has not sought to rebalance sympathy between these two women. It has sought to rebalance attention. Julia Martha Thomas was not merely a victim. She was a widow navigating a narrow margin of independence through discipline and domestic control. Her authority was legitimate, socially sanctioned, and necessary within the world she inhabited. Kate Webster was not merely a monster. She was a woman shaped by a system that demanded obedience without offering security and punished resistance without offering repair. Both women were operating within the same structure, from opposite ends of its hierarchy. To recognize this is not to absolve Webster of responsibility. It is to refuse the comfort of simplification. Violence does not emerge from nowhere. Nor does punishment. The certainty with which the state condemned Webster reflects not only the brutality of her act, but the symbolic threat it posed. A servant who stayed revealed that authority depended on silence. Once that silence broke, eradication became the only imaginable response. Kate Webster borrowed authority for a matter of days. She was executed for it. That exchange, brief occupation followed by absolute erasure, reveals the limits of domestic obedience in Victorian England more clearly than any rulebook or sermon. It shows how quickly a system that relies on internalized submission moves to eliminate those who expose its fragility. This is not a story about a woman who emerged from nowhere to commit an unforgivable act. It is a story about a society that could imagine no response other than elimination once its hierarchies were made visible. The execution closed the case. It did not close the questions the case continues to raise. Appendix A. Objects as evidence. How things spoke when people would not. Victorian criminal justice relied not only on bodies and testimony, but on objects, mundane items whose movement or misuse rendered private actions visible. In the Webster case, objects did not merely corroborate events. They structured interpretation. Clothing. Mrs. Thomas's garments, worn openly by Webster and recognized by neighbors, functioned as evidence of occupation rather than theft. Clothing collapsed the boundary between servant and mistress, transforming impersonation into proof of audacity. Household goods. Items sold or pawned, linen, utensils, personal effects, created a chain of witnesses. Each transaction extended the narrative outward, converting concealment into circulation. Objects traveled faster than explanations. Domestic tools. Knives, basins, fires, and refuse containers were not extraordinary instruments. Their ordinariness was precisely what unsettled. Tools associated with care and maintenance became implicated in erasure, allowing the prosecution to frame concealment as calculated rather than desperate. The house itself. Rooms, surfaces, and routines functioned as composite evidence. The household bore traces of disruption that contradicted the performance of normalcy. The house became an archive against its occupant. Together, these objects transformed absence into presence. They required no intention, no confession, no psychological insight. They spoke through use, movement, and recognition. In doing so, they reduced the space available for interpretation long before the trial began. Bibliography. Primary legal and archival sources. Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey Proceedings Online. Regina v. Kate Webster, 1879. Old Bailey Proceedings Online, 1674–1913. https://www.oldbaileyonline.org, trial transcript, witness testimony, judicial summing up and sentencing. The National Archives, UK. Home Office and Assize Records, HO and ASSI Series. Kate Webster Committal, Correspondence, and Execution Records. Metropolitan Police Records. Contemporary investigative reports relating to the murder of Julia Martha Thomas. Contemporary newspapers and periodicals. The Times, London, 1879. The Daily Telegraph, 1879. The Penny Illustrated Paper and Illustrated Times, 1879. Reynolds's Newspaper, 1879. The Illustrated Police News, 1879. Biographical and case-specific sources. Rappaport, Helen. Beautiful Forever, Madame Rachel of Bond Street. St. Martin's Press, 2001. Watson, Catherine D. Poisoned Lives, English Poisoners and Their Victims. Hambledon Continuum, 2004. Nelman, Judith. Twisting in the Wind, The Murderess and the English Press. University of Toronto Press, 1998. Social History and Domestic Service. Davidoff, Leonore, and Catherine Hall. Family Fortunes, Men and Women of the English Middle Class 1780–1850. University of Chicago Press, 1987. Flanders, Judith. The Victorian City, Everyday Life in Dickens' London. Atlantic Books, 2014. Higginbotham, Peter. The Workhouse Encyclopedia. Pen and Sword, 2012. Mayhew, Henry. London Labour and the London Poor. Various editions. Ross, Ellen. Love and Toil, Motherhood in Outcast London. Oxford University Press, 1993. Crime, Gender, and Justice. Arnott, Margaret L. and Corneli Usborne, eds. Gender and Crime in Modern Europe. UCL Press, 1999. Clancy, Deirdre. Women, Crime and Punishment in Victorian England. Routledge, 2013. Emsley, Clive. Crime and Society in England, 1750 to 1900. Pearson, 2014. Walkowitz, Judith. City of Dreadful Delight, Narratives of Sexual Danger in Late Victorian London. University of Chicago Press, 1992.